Tonight, we kindly ask you not to speak. Just enjoy the celebration. That's what the email said. No thank you. No, we'd love to honor you. Just a polite muzzle dressed in corporate courtesy. I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. Then I didn't. I closed the laptop, sat in the quiet, and realized something I wasn't ready to admit. They wanted my silence more than my story. It wasn't the first time I'd been asked to step aside, but this one hurt differently. This wasn't just a meeting. It wasn't just a rebrand or a budget cut. It was the 50th anniversary of the company I helped build with my bare hands. The one we started in the back of a rented garage, with broken printers, second-hand desks, and dreams no one else believed in. And now, all these years later, I was told not to speak. When I arrived at the venue, my name wasn't on the front row, not even in the second. They'd placed me near the exit. A small card that read Mr. Grayson sat crookedly at the corner of table 11, far enough from the stage that I could barely hear the mic check. I smiled. Not because I was amused, but because after everything, this was the most honest thing they'd done. The lights dimmed, the music started. A young, well-dressed MC with a polished voice stepped up to the podium. He welcomed the guests, thanked the partners, and introduced the new board. A slideshow began behind him, filled with glowing photos of recent years, shiny new buildings, award ceremonies, team retreats. Not one picture of the garage, not one mention of the 5 of us who used to split lunch sandwiches just to make payroll. I sat quietly, nodding, breathing. They hadn't erased me completely. That would have made them feel guilty. No, this was smarter. They just buried me, deep in the program, somewhere between welcome drinks and closing remarks. A footnote dressed as a tribute. I reached into my coat pocket and felt the small flash. Drive I'd brought, just a backup, just in case. It held 12 minutes of footage, grainy but real, interviews with the original team, clips from the first product launch, footage of Marcy laughing when the ceiling collapsed during a thunderstorm, her voice still full of belief. None of them were here tonight. 2 had passed away. 1 retired in silence. 1 had simply disappeared, heartbroken after his ideas were patented under someone else's name. And I was seated by the exit. I watched as people laughed, clinked glasses, and gave standing ovations to men who had once mocked our spreadsheets and told us, this isn't scalable. But none of that compared to the moment that came next. Because as I sipped my lukewarm coffee, a young intern passed by my table and looked down at my name tag. He paused, eyes widened. Mr. Grayson? He whispered. I nodded slowly. His mouth parted like he was about to say something else. But instead, he just stepped back and whispered to himself, I thought you were a myth? A myth. That's what I had become. Not a man, not a founder. A story passed down by someone in training. A flicker of a name on an old plaque no one could find anymore. But I was here, in flesh and blood. And tonight, if they didn't want me to speak, I would let the video speak for me. Friends, let me take a quick pause. Could you write in the comments? Where are you listening from? Have you ever been in a situation where your voice was silenced, even though your story mattered? If this story resonates with you, please consider subscribing and sharing the video. That's how you help us grow this channel and bring more powerful stories to light. Now, let's continue. Let's keep it short tonight, he said with that polite, almost rehearsed smile that young professionals wear when they're instructed to deliver uncomfortable messages. He was probably no older than my grandson. Shoes shined, suit still smelling like the department store it came from, clipboard tucked tight against his chest like a shield. We've got a tight schedule, he added, and a lot of speakers. We really appreciate you being here, but if it's all right, maybe we'll save your remarks for another time. I just looked at him, not angry, not even surprised. I'd seen this before, that smile, that tension behind the eyes, the way people shift when they're about to erase you, but want you to believe it's in your best interest. I nodded. He seemed relieved, as if the worst part of his job was now over. Thank you so much for understanding, he said quickly, already turning back toward the stage. But he didn't understand. None of them did. It wasn't about the speech. It wasn't about the 5 minutes I had been promised. It wasn't even about me standing in front of the room. It was about memory. It was about being remembered, about being seen. I looked around the ballroom, walls draped in banners that said, innovation, growth, vision, all in metallic lettering, all crisp and modern. But I remembered when this company didn't have money for banners, when our vision was scribbled on whiteboards that barely erased, when we grew because we stayed up until 2 in the morning patching holes no one else saw. I remembered the nights we couldn't afford heating, so we took turns bringing in space heaters from home. I remembered printing flyers at the local library because the toner was too expensive. I remembered sleeping in the office during that first year, when everything we had was one broken contract away from collapsing. They don't teach that part. They show charts now, growth curves and performance metrics. They show the new building, the expanded teams, the smiling interns who pose for group shots at corporate retreats. But they never show what it cost. They never talk about who paid for that success in silence. I took my seat again, the same one, near the exit. I folded my hands in my lap and listened as they introduced the next guest, a marketing executive who had reshaped the company's global voice. She spoke well, confident, poised. Her slides lit up the room in blues and golds. The audience applauded politely. No one noticed me sitting just a few feet away, still holding the printed copy of my speech, just in case. I didn't need applause. I didn't even need recognition. But I had been promised 5 minutes. Just 5. Not because I had something to prove, but because I had something to protect. Something sacred, and now it was clear. They didn't want me to speak, because my voice carried something theirs didn't. History, grit, and the uncomfortable truth that success often grows from the cracked hands and sleepless nights of people no one claps for. They wanted polish. I brought dust. They wanted legacy and logos. I brought names no one remembered anymore. So I folded the paper once, then twice, slipped it back into my pocket, and said nothing, but my silence wasn't surrender. It was waiting. The lights on stage shifted between cool blues and soft golds, the kind of corporate elegance you find at fundraising galas or award ceremonies, where everything is scripted down to the applause cues. Each speaker that took the mic carried themselves with confidence, smiles sharpened by media training, voices smooth and practiced. They spoke of exponential growth, of quarterly margins, of sleek partnerships and breakthrough technologies. And as I sat there, my hands folded in my lap, I listened. To all of it, to the charts and buzzwords, to the language that made everything sound so effortless, like it had all appeared one morning with the right idea and a smart investment. As if this empire had built itself out of pure vision and the perfect timing of perfect people. But I knew the truth. I had lived the truth, and the truth had sweat on its brow and calluses on its hands. The truth smelled like burnt coffee at 2 a.m. and dust from a storage unit that became an office. The truth was a tangle of wires and borrowed chairs, of working heaters with broken thermostats, of passwords scribbled on the backs of receipts. It was long nights with aching backs and short tempers, with laughter that came only because the alternative was crying. It was 5 people sharing one dream, and sometimes one coat. I looked around the room now at the rows of fresh suits and polished heels, at the gleaming decor and LED walls, so clean, so curated, so forgetful. Not a single mention of the warehouse on 10th Street where it all began. Not a nod to Marcy, who did payroll by hand for 2 years straight, while raising 2 toddlers and battling leukemia. No slide for Harold, who once wired half the building himself because we couldn't afford an electrician. Not even a photograph of those earliest days, when desks were folding tables, and our lounge area was 2 plastic chairs next to a vending machine that only worked if you hit it on the side. That part of the story didn't make the program, because that kind of story doesn't shine under stage lights. It lives in memory, in quiet corners, in forgotten folders at the bottom of locked drawers. It exists in handshakes made without lawyers, in trust built before contracts, in people who gave everything not for a paycheck, but for a future no one else believed in yet. I shifted in my seat. Someone 2 rows ahead leaned over and whispered something, then laughed. I watched as a young woman accepted an award and thanked her mentor, someone I didn't recognize. She spoke of innovation and legacy. Legacy. That word echoed in my mind. They used it so freely, so easily, as if legacy were something you acquired, not something you gave your life to. As if it could be summarized in a catchphrase or sealed in a marketing packet. But legacy isn't clean, it isn't a brand. Legacy is built in the invisible hours. And mine was being politely erased. No malice, no cruelty, just omission. The slow, quiet death of history under the weight of convenience. I didn't expect applause. I didn't come for recognition. But as I watched the stage flash with words like vision and courage and first, I realized they weren't just rewriting the future. They were burying the past. And I was still sitting here, alive, breathing, remembering. A witness no one wanted. A chapter no one read aloud. But still, part of the book. In the inner pocket of my blazer, wrapped in a soft cloth like something sacred, was a small black flash drive. Nothing special on the outside, just plastic and metal. But inside, 12 minutes that the room wasn't prepared for. I hadn't told anyone I was bringing it. Not the organizers, not the staff, not even my daughter, who had once told me, lovingly but firmly, to let go of the past and enjoy the evening. But I couldn't. Not this time. Not after watching them carve out everything raw and real and replace it with polished sound bites. The video was made in secret, not for revenge, not out of bitterness, but out of duty. A promise made in a hospital room years ago, as my oldest friend, our original CFO, lay hooked up to machines, his voice barely above a whisper. "If they forget," he said, "promise me you'll remind them." So I had. I collected footage. I called the children of those who had passed. I dug through old tapes, camcorder clips, photographs curled at the edges. Some were blurry. Others shook from laughter. There were clips of our first meeting, filmed by accident, when someone pressed record instead of play. You could hear our voices, awkward, uncertain, full of dreams and fear. You could see our eyes, hopeful, tired, and young. There were shots of our first product, glitchy, clunky, barely held together with tape and caffeine. But it was ours. We had built it with nothing but time, trust, and stubbornness. That machine didn't change the world, but it gave us a reason to try again the next morning. There was Marcy, swearing at a copier that ate her last invoice. Harold, with grease on his shirt, explaining code with his hands like it was a language only he could speak. There was me, hair darker, voice louder, eyes less weathered, laughing over a whiteboard, drawing ideas that looked more like wild guesses. And in the final minutes, there were voices, interviews, not testimonials, but truths. From people who had been there at the beginning, people who remembered the mold on the basement ceiling, the flood that destroyed our only server, the night we almost closed for good. People who weren't famous, people who weren't invited to this stage. They talked about sacrifice, about friendship, about failure, and above all, about purpose. A kind of purpose that didn't come with shares or stock options. The kind that came with knowing your life mattered because you gave it to something bigger than yourself. I hadn't watched the full video since editing it. Couldn't. It hurt too much. Like opening a box of voices that no longer existed in the world, but lived on through pixel and memory. But I had it, right there in my coat. While they toasted the visionaries and trailblazers, I ran my thumb over the flash drive's edge like a rosary. I didn't know if I'd use it. I didn't know if the moment would come. But I knew this. If I left this evening in silence, if I let them turn 50 years of sweat and soul into a slideshow of slogans, then it wouldn't be just me they erased. It would be all of us. The ones who started it. The ones who stayed when the doors almost closed. The ones who were never quoted in Forbes, but kept the lights on. And so I waited, patiently, quietly, with 12 minutes of truth in my pocket, and a promise still burning in my chest. He was the kind of man who never needed the spotlight, just a sturdy chair, a clean notepad, and a good cup of coffee to keep the world turning. Harold didn't talk much, but when he did, people leaned in, not because he was loud, but because he didn't waste words. He chose them like bricks, building things you could trust. We met in the late 80s, both of us working 2 jobs and dreaming past exhaustion. He was better with numbers than anyone I've ever met. I was the one who could talk our way into a loan or out of a disaster. We balanced each other. We built everything from nothing together. And when we finally registered the company, I remember us standing outside the county office in the cold with the paper in our hands, grinning like idiots. "Now what?" I asked him. He just smiled. "Now we don't quit." And we didn't. Through flooded offices, canceled deals, and months when we couldn't afford payroll, but paid it anyway. When his wife got sick, he brought her to the office on a cot so he could watch over her while working. When my marriage cracked under the pressure, he sat beside me and said nothing, just sat and stayed. Years later, as the company grew, others came in, slicker, louder, younger. Some rolled their eyes at Harold's old-school methods. They called him slow, outdated. But what they didn't see was that every policy they admired had his fingerprints on it. Every system they bragged about was something he built on scratch paper and late nights. 3 years ago, I sat by his hospital bed as machines breathed for him. The company had already begun to shift. New management, new values. He knew what was coming. He knew his name would fade, that memories grow short when profit grows long. And that night, his voice barely more than a rasp, he reached for my hand. His eyes, still sharp under tired lids, held mine. "If they forget who we were," he said, "you remind them. Promise me, Ray, promise me." I nodded. I couldn't speak. I just held his hand and watched his eyes close for the last time. Today, as the ballroom filled with curated nostalgia and sanitized gratitude, no one said his name. No photo of him on the slideshow. No mention in the timeline they projected on the LED wall. Just empty space where a cornerstone used to be. But I remembered the way his handwriting curled when he was tired. I remembered the leather-bound notebook he carried everywhere, filled with sketches and numbers. I remembered how he made sure the janitors got bonuses before the board approved their own. I remembered what this place was before it had walls of glass and a waiting list for interns, and I remembered the promise. I didn't make many in my life, but the ones I did, I kept. Tonight they asked me not to speak, and maybe they thought that would be the end of it. But I didn't need a podium. I had a flash drive. I had his voice, his face, his truth, and I had a story that deserved more than silence. I glanced at the stage where someone was now giving an award, named after a man who joined the company 20 years after Harold died. It didn't matter, because Harold never needed his name in lights, but he deserved to be remembered, and tonight he would be. The applause was thunderous, the kind that echoes off marble walls and leaves a kind of tremble in the air, not from admiration, but from performance. A standing ovation carefully orchestrated as the new CEO took the stage with all the ease and confidence of a man born into comfort, not carved through hardship. He wore the kind of suit that said, "Nothing touches me." Sharp lines, expensive stitching, a tie that probably cost more than Harold's old car. He stepped up to the podium like he belonged there, and perhaps in this version of the company he did. He smiled, cameras clicked, phones rose in unison like a wave. "Tonight," he began, "we celebrate 50 years of excellence, innovation, and vision." He paused for effect, let the words breathe. "I want to thank those who came before us, the pioneers, the early builders, the dreamers who laid the foundation for where we stand today." Another pause, another wave of applause. But no names, no faces, just those who came before. I sat in my seat, still at the edge of the room, still closer to the exit than the stage, and felt the same chill I had felt the day we moved out of the garage, when we left the cracked walls and water-stained ceilings behind, and walked into a new office that didn't smell like sweat and dust, but like fresh paint and uncertainty. Even then I knew something was slipping, but this was different. This wasn't just forgetting, this was erasing with a smile and a spotlight. They didn't just leave us out. They rewrote the beginning. I looked around at the crowd, hundreds of faces, many of them young, fresh, full of energy. They clapped without hesitation, because to them, he was the beginning. the man in the photo, the voice on the internal newsletter, the one who told the story they'd all memorized without ever questioning it. And maybe it wasn't their fault. How could they know that the man standing on that stage had once sat across from me 15 years ago, interviewing for a mid-level position in marketing? That he had asked about our core values, and I'd told him, people first, always. Now here he was, delivering a speech written by someone else, thanking invisible hands while looking directly into a crowd that never saw mine. The irony was poetic, almost cruel. Because this applause, it wasn't for me. It wasn't for Harold. It wasn't for Marcy or Jamal or Linda or the dozens of others who never made it past the first decade, but gave more of themselves than anyone would ever know. It was for the myth, for the version of the story that looked good in brochures and investor decks. The version that didn't have broken nights or empty bank accounts. The version that started clean and stayed clean. And yet, I didn't stand, I didn't clap, I didn't flinch. I just sat there, my hands resting calmly on my knees, the flash drive heavy in my pocket like a heartbeat. I wasn't bitter, I wasn't angry. I was just awake. Awake to the truth that time doesn't erase what matters, only people do. And that applause, it wasn't for me. But what I carried with me, it didn't need applause, it just needed a screen. A soft voice broke the rhythm of applause still lingering in the air. Excuse me, are you Thomas? I turned slowly. The voice belonged to a young man, early 20s maybe, fresh face, wide eyes, a badge hanging from his neck that still had the corners uncreased. He wasn't like the others. He hadn't learned how to wear indifference like a suit jacket yet. I thought it might be you, he said. We studied a little about you during the internship orientation, just briefly. You were, one of the originals, right? His voice held that mix of reverence and confusion that young people often carry when something doesn't add up. Like he had read about a mountain and suddenly realized it was sitting quietly in the back of the room. I nodded, offering the kind of smile that doesn't reach the eyes but means well. He leaned in a little, voice barely above a whisper. But why weren't you on stage? It was such an honest question, so simple, so devastating. I looked at him, this stranger who somehow remembered what others forgot, and said only, sometimes the stage chooses those who are louder, not those who were there first. He blinked, unsure what to say next, and I didn't need him to. He meant no harm. He didn't understand yet how history is rewritten, not with lies, but with omissions, with softer spotlights and better angles. Still, that whisper stayed with me, because for a moment, someone saw me, not as a relic, not as an inconvenient shadow, but as a man whose fingerprints were still on the walls, even if the paint tried to cover them. He thanked me quietly and slipped away, back into the stream of bright young faces, all drifting toward the stage, toward possibility. But he'd left something behind, a small echo of truth in a room drowning in polish. And I sat with it. I let it settle deep. Because the silence from the organizers, from the board, from the CEO, it had been loud. But this whisper had weight. And I knew in that moment that there were still some, perhaps just a few, who wanted to know the real story, who didn't clap just because everyone else did, who might someday be in rooms like this and ask, but who was here first? It was a small thread, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that even if I never touched that stage, my presence had already done what speeches couldn't. It reminded someone to ask, and maybe, just maybe, to remember. It happened suddenly, like a breath held too long. The host's voice rang out, confident, bright, echoing through the glass and steel ballroom. And now a toast from our first investor. The words slid easily into the room, but they didn't know. They didn't realize what they had just done. They thought it would be someone else, one of the names on the current board, someone safe, someone rehearsed. But I knew this was the moment I had been waiting for, not because I craved the spotlight, but because it was the only moment they left open, a brief crack in the wall where truth could slip through. I stood up slowly, not rushed, not nervous, as if I had been standing for 50 years and only now allowed myself to straighten my back. The chair creaked behind me. A few heads turned. I didn't walk to the stage. I walked to the side of the room, to the podium's small console where a laptop controlled the presentation. A young technician looked up, startled. I nodded, gently placed the flash drive in his hand. "Just play it," I said softly. "No introduction." His eyes flicked toward the stage, uncertain. "Please." There was something in my voice, not force, not anger, just gravity. He hesitated, then inserted the drive and tapped the screen. The music died, the room dimmed, the air shifted. On the towering screen behind the stage, the video flickered to life. No logo, no title card, no sound at first, just a grainy clip from decades ago. A shaky handheld shot of 5 people standing outside a warehouse, holding paper coffee cups and laughing. There were no suits, no captions, no polish, just raw memory. And then the voices began, faded, cracked with time, but real. We didn't have a business plan. We had a couch, 2 fans, and 1 broken heater. Cut to a dim office, boxes stacked to the ceiling, a desk made of plywood and milk crates. That first winter we wore coats inside, but we showed up, every day, because the dream was warmer than the room. The room fell still, utterly still. Forks froze midair, wine glasses lowered without a sound. Even the host had stopped speaking, because this wasn't part of the program. This wasn't glossy or branded. It was honest. The footage shifted to Harold, his voice thin but proud. I told Ray, if we're ever in suits, we better remember the smell of this floor. Then laughter, real, loud, messy. The kind of laughter that only comes from people who've been through the fire and stayed. Another voice, Marcy's, from years before her passing. We were broke, but it felt like gold. And then silence. A clip of us sitting around a folding table, not speaking, just working. Together, shoulder to shoulder, tired, alive. And finally, the last frame. A still image, the original 5 of us, smiling. Framed not by stage lights, but by warehouse windows and peeling paint. No credits, no music, just 12 minutes of something no award could recreate. I turned to face the room. They were watching. Some had tears in their eyes. Some lowered their gaze. And a few, just a few, were clapping, slowly, softly, as if they were afraid to disturb the ghost that had just passed through the room. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The story had been told, not by words, but by truth. And for the first time that night, the silence wasn't empty. It was full of memory, full of presence, full of all the names they forgot to say. And in that moment, I finally stood, not to be seen, but to be heard. The screen didn't just show a video. It opened a door, not to a boardroom or a press release, but to something sacred, something too heavy to carry in words and too real to stage. The polished ballroom fell away, and in its place came the hum of old lights, the flicker of tube monitors, and the echo of footsteps in concrete halls we once called an office. The video began to breathe. First, it showed the dust, the kind that danced in slivers of morning light between half-broken blinds. We'd come in early, sometimes before sunrise, to beat the heat or avoid traffic, but mostly because there was something electric in those early hours when the world was asleep, and we still believed anything was possible. Then came the sounds. Not music, not narration, just life. The low static hum of an old heater, a chair squeaking, a phone ringing endlessly, a burst of laughter from a joke no one remembered, but everyone felt. And then her, my wife. She was younger, beautiful in a way the world doesn't photograph, but you never forget. Her hair was tied back, her sleeves rolled to the elbows. She was reading out numbers from a handwritten ledger. 3 a.m, coffee long gone cold beside her. Her voice was steady, patient, even when the math didn't add up, even when the funds didn't stretch far enough. She had been the heart of the operation, unpaid, unseen, irreplaceable. And there she was, alive again for just a moment, between 2 flickers of time. I felt something catch in my chest, grief and gratitude braided into one. I hadn't expected her to be in the final cut, but there she was, smiling, working, carrying the weight of a dream too heavy for most. The screen shifted. My friend, Harold, sat in his chair, a scarf wrapped around his neck in the middle of summer. He always said the cold was in his bones. He was speaking to the camera reluctantly, his words careful. We didn't know what we were doing, he admitted, but we knew why we were doing it. And that why? It pulsed through every frame that followed. Quick cuts of our first prototypes, pieces duct taped together but functional, boards covered in Post-its, birthday celebrations with grocery store cupcakes and hand-drawn cards. One shot of the ceiling leaking, with 3 of us holding buckets, and still laughing like it was all part of the plan. No suits, no titles, just people, trying, failing, starting over, again and again and again. And near the end, short interviews we recorded years later. A janitor who said, "They treated me like I was part of something, not just someone who cleaned it." A former intern, now a mother of 3, whispering, "I still remember what Ray told me my first day. Your voice matters." That changed everything. Then came the laughter. That kind of honest, belly-deep laughter that comes after 18-hour days and no guarantees. The kind that only survives where the truth lives. And in the final seconds, nothing. No logo, no credits. Just a wide shot of the old office at dusk. Empty now, quiet. And underneath it all, the sound of a pencil scratching paper. Then black. The lights in the ballroom remained dim for a heartbeat too long. Long enough for people to feel something they hadn't expected to feel tonight. The weight of forgotten hands. The beauty of unmarketed moments. The value of the quiet builders. I looked around. Some had tears in their eyes, though they didn't know why. Others shifted in their chairs like the floor beneath them had moved. A few sat still, frozen as if memory had crept in and sat on their shoulders. And maybe it had. Because that screen didn't just play a video. It told the truth. And for the first time in a very long time, the truth had an audience. At first there were chuckles. The kind people make when they're caught off guard, nervous, dismissive, not unkind, just unsure what they're watching. Grainy footage, outdated clothes, a woman with a binder and a baby on her hip, a man trying to fax something 3 times before giving up and calling it in. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't curated. It was real. Some in the room exchanged glances, a whisper here, a smirk there. A few laughed softly when the ceiling leaked and someone taped a trash bag to catch the drips. It looked chaotic, primitive, even laughable in contrast to the sleek presentation they had seen earlier. But then something began to shift. Somewhere between the 2nd minute and the 5th, the laughter softened, then stilled, because the hands they were laughing at were building something sacred, because the voice they found amusing belonged to the woman who used to sleep under her desk so she wouldn't miss payroll, because the faces on that flickering screen had no makeup, no filters, no branding, only determination etched deep into every line. They watched as we passed around one computer because it was all we had. They saw our Christmas dinner, takeout containers on an old file cabinet, everyone sitting on the floor, toasting with paper cups and exhausted smiles. They watched Harold rewire a circuit by hand because we couldn't afford an electrician. They watched me tear up a personal check to cover someone's medical bills. And one by one, the faces in the room began to change. The young intern who had whispered to me earlier sat straighter now, eyes locked on the screen. A woman in a sharp navy pantsuit lowered her phone. The CFO paused mid-bite, the fork hovering in the air, because it was finally sinking in. This company didn't begin with a pitch deck. It began with people, with cracked hands and stubborn hearts, with those who stayed when it would have been easier to leave. They saw my wife again, sitting at her desk, rubbing her eyes, murmuring, "We'll make it work." They saw Harold leaning over blueprints drawn by flashlight after the power was cut. They saw birthday cakes made from leftover muffins and a thank you card signed with crayons because there was no money for anything else. And they began to understand, not intellectually, viscerally. What had looked like chaos was courage. What had seemed unprofessional was sacrifice. What they thought was failure was the cost of beginning. The smirks faded, the whispers died. And in their place, silence. A sacred collective quiet. Not because they were told to be silent, but because something true had entered the room and demanded reverence. They were seeing, maybe for the first time, what legacy looks like before it's comfortable, and they couldn't look away. I stood in the shadows near the wall, hands folded. I wasn't watching the screen anymore. I was watching them, How the CEO now stared, unmoving, how the host had set his note cards aside, how the board members, once relaxed, now sat upright, almost ashamed. They had believed a myth for so long they forgot what the truth felt like. But tonight, truth had played itself across the wall, and it didn't ask permission. It simply arrived, and in doing so turned laughter into memory, and memory into something that could never again be ignored. There I was, suddenly filling the screen, younger, tired, sweat on my forehead, a shadow of worry under my eyes, but something in my voice that still carried fire. The image was shaky, filmed on an old camcorder, but my words cut through time like they'd been waiting all these years to be heard. "We're not building a business," I said. "We're building trust." My voice trembled slightly in the clip, not from fear, but from the weight of knowing what we were carrying back then. People's livelihoods, their hopes, their rent checks, and their children's futures. We weren't chasing empires. We were just trying to hold people together. And now, decades later, that forgotten footage silenced a room full of strategy slides, champagne glasses, and self-congratulation. The words hung in the air, heavier than any speech delivered that night. A woman near the back wiped her eyes. Another shifted uncomfortably, lowering her gaze. One of the executives reached for a glass of water, but didn't drink. Even the CEO, who had earlier stood with all the certainty of a man at the summit, now sat still, blinking slowly, as if the weight of what had come before him had finally settled onto his shoulders. They weren't looking at a stranger. They were looking at someone who had once stood exactly where they were, but with no fanfare, no applause, just grit and belief. I had forgotten that footage existed. Harold must have filmed it. He always had that old camera on the corner shelf of his desk, the one he'd pick up when he thought no one was watching. He must have captured that moment without me knowing, just like he had captured the smell of burned coffee and the sound of all of us arguing over missing invoices and frozen code. And now, that moment, raw and unpolished, was holding a mirror up to an entire generation of leaders who had inherited something they never saw built. And in their eyes I saw the realization, not guilt, not shame, but awakening, because the truth of it is, legacy isn't passed down on paper. It's passed through presence, through nights no one writes about, through sacrifices no one thanks you for. That younger version of me, up there on the screen, had no idea whether the company would survive another month. He just knew that if it did, it had to be something people could believe in, not just buy from. And now, 50 years later, in a room full of progress and polish, those eyes couldn't look away. Not from the dirt under our nails, not from the sleepless nights, not from the real reason this company existed at all. Because trust was never a slogan. It was built, one broken chair, one handwritten check, one unshakable moment at a time. And as my old voice faded into the dark again and the screen slipped back to black, no one applauded, no one spoke. But in that silence I heard something louder than clapping. I heard understanding, and that was all I had ever wanted. The screen went black. No logo, no fade-out music, no narrator summing it all up with a clever tagline. Just silence. Heavy, complete, honest. For a moment it felt like time stopped. The air in the room had shifted, as if it too was holding its breath. No one moved. No one reached for their drink. No one tried to be the first to speak. The truth had settled in like a fog, thick and undeniable. Then from somewhere near the middle of the room came the sound. Not words, not commentary, just two hands clapping. Soft at first, not performative, not rushed. A rhythm born not of obligation, but of recognition. Then another pair of hands, a second person rising slowly to their feet. Not because they had to, but because something inside of them refused to stay seated. And then another, and another, until the entire ballroom, the one that had been so busy clapping for titles and spreadsheets, was now standing. Not for a man, not for a memory, but for meaning. It wasn't the kind of applause you see at award shows. It didn't come with forced smiles or sideways glances. This was slower, heavier, as if each clap was an offering, a confession, a quiet way of saying, "We didn't know, but we see it now." Still I didn't move. I stood at the side of the room, not behind the podium, not under the lights, just me, hands folded, eyes steady. I didn't bow, I didn't wave, I didn't smile. because this wasn't about me. It was about everyone who had been forgotten. It was about Harold and Marcy and the interns who never made it past 3 months but left their fingerprints on the foundation. It was about my wife and her tired eyes at 3 in the morning. It was about those long nights and broken heaters and Christmas bonuses paid out of empty pockets. The applause continued, not louder, just deeper. People weren't clapping to celebrate. They were clapping to remember. A few had tears on their cheeks. Quiet ones wiped quickly, as if they didn't want to admit the weight of what they'd just witnessed. A man near the stage lowered his head, pressing both palms together, not in prayer, but in respect. The CEO remained seated, still, reflective. He didn't try to reclaim the moment. He didn't speak. Maybe he finally understood this wasn't a moment you could narrate. You could only honor it. And that was enough. Because applause that isn't asked for, that isn't scheduled or expected, is the rarest kind of truth. And in that moment, I knew. I didn't need a speech. I didn't need a plaque. I didn't even need a name in the program. I had done what I promised I would. I reminded them, and now the echo of that truth, wrapped in the rhythm of honest hands, filled the room in a way no spotlight ever could. I didn't walk to the stage. I didn't reach for the microphone. It sat there waiting, tall, sleek, sterile. The kind of microphone designed for polished words and clever lines. But this moment didn't need cleverness. It didn't need noise. It had already spoken. I just stood where I was, a few steps from the shadows, and looked out over the room. Hundreds of faces. Some I recognized, most I didn't. But I had known their types. The eager eyes of the interns. The same spark I used to see when we handed someone their first badge and said, "You belong." The polished faces of department heads. Older now, dressed in success. Shoulders square with pride, but softened by something they couldn't name yet. The board members, once boys in mismatched socks, sitting on milk crates around a shared pizza box, now dressed in tailored suits and quiet regret, and scattered among them, the new generation, young, sharp, unaware until this night, whose names were missing from the plaques they walked past every morning. And as I stood there, silent, still, I realized something I hadn't known until that very second. I wasn't sad. Not anymore. I wasn't bitter or aching or empty. Because what I saw wasn't just people standing and clapping. It was people remembering. Remembering not just what built this place, but who. The man 2 rows back had once spilled coffee on my notebook and apologized 6 times in one breath. He now led a division. His eyes were glassy. The woman near the wall had started as a part-time receptionist. I taught her how to use a copy machine when it jammed, and how to breathe when it felt like the walls were closing in. Her hand was over her mouth now. I looked further, into the corners. There in the very back, the maintenance staff had paused mid-shift. One of them, an older man with a worn badge and tired shoes, stood perfectly still, like someone had cracked open time and let the past speak directly to him. He nodded at me, a small, almost invisible gesture, but I saw it. Because he knew. And maybe that was the miracle of it all, the realization that I didn't need a microphone to be heard. Not tonight, not anymore. The room itself was listening. Every floorboard, every table, every framed award that had once forgotten the fingerprints behind it. They were listening now. And the people? They weren't looking at a ghost. They were looking at one of the living stones beneath their feet. The kind of stone that doesn't ask for spotlight, but holds the weight of everything above it. So I nodded, to no one, and to everyone, and without a single word I stepped back into the quiet, because I didn't come for applause. I came for truth, and truth, finally, had been heard. The room had begun to empty. The buzz of conversation slowly returned, but it was different now, quieter, gentler, uncertain, like everyone was walking through a museum of memories they never knew existed. Glasses clinked less frequently. Laughter, if it came at all, came with a weight. You could almost hear people recalibrating what they thought they knew. I stayed near the back. I didn't mingle, didn't seek anyone out. I had no more to say. Tonight wasn't about talking anymore. It was about witnessing. And that's when I saw her, my daughter. She hadn't approached during the standing ovation. She hadn't clapped with the others. She had sat motionless throughout the video, arms folded tightly, like she was holding something inside that might break loose if she didn't brace herself. And for the rest of the evening, she hadn't looked in my direction. Until now, her heels clicked softly against the marble floor, but every step felt like a lifetime. My little girl, now a grown woman, polished and poised, every inch the corporate leader she had worked so hard to become. She walked like someone who had made peace with every choice she'd ever made. But when she stopped in front of me, she looked small. Not because she was weak, but because something had cracked open in her. Her lips parted like she had prepared something to say, something careful and composed. But then she looked into my eyes, and the words dissolved. She reached out, and without a word she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. Not a polite hug, not the formal embrace of family for appearances, but the kind of hug a daughter gives when something inside her finally understands what it cost her father to keep her world standing. I felt her shoulders tremble. "I didn't know," she whispered, barely audible, her voice thick. I didn't know, but now I do. I didn't need her to say more. I didn't need her to apologize for the years she had seen me as someone behind the times, or for the business dinners where she'd introduced me with vague titles and quick transitions, or for the moments she corrected my old stories as if they were relics of a world too far gone to matter. She didn't need to say any of that, because in her silence I heard everything, and in that embrace I felt time fold in on itself. Years of distance, generations of effort, all wrapped into a single trembling heartbeat. I held her tightly, not to prove anything, not to make a point, but simply because she was mine, because we were part of the same story, one that no title or presentation could rewrite. She stepped back slowly, wiping her eyes with the edge of her blazer sleeve, then gave me a look I had never seen from her before. It wasn't pity. It wasn't embarrassment. It wasn't even pride. It was something far rarer. It was respect, and in that look, I saw the legacy I had hoped for. Not in buildings or stock prices, but in a daughter who finally saw the man beneath the myth. And that, after all the years, was more than enough. I left before dessert. No handshakes, no lingering conversations, no photos near the company banner. My name wasn't printed on any of the elegant menus, and I didn't need it to be. I'd already said everything I came to say without uttering a single word. The air outside was cooler than I expected. A soft breeze stirred the edge of my coat as I stepped into the parking lot, its silence a stark contrast to the velvet buzz of the ballroom behind me. I didn't look back, not because I was bitter, but because I had already taken everything I needed from that room. Not in applause, not in recognition, but in remembrance. For the first time in years, I walked away feeling seen. It's a strange thing to carry a legacy that no one remembers until they do. To give your years, your sweat, your soul to something, and watch it grow into a giant that forgets the hands that fed it. And yet, tonight, even if just for a moment, the room remembered. Not just me, but all of us, the quiet workers, the late-night fixers, the ones who never made the newsletters or the annual reports, the ones who bled into the carpet and cried in the janitor's closet when the weight of holding it all together became too much. I wasn't the only one who walked that kind of road. I know that now. There were dozens, maybe hundreds. And tonight, their faces flickered across that screen, immortal for just 12 minutes, and unforgettable ever since. Some might still forget again tomorrow. That's the nature of time, of progress. But not everyone will, because truth, once spoken, even silently, has a way of rooting itself in the walls, in the floorboards, in the hearts of those who are ready to listen. And tonight, they listened. I didn't stay for compliments. I didn't hand out business cards or stand beneath the spotlight hoping for a photo. I just walked to my car, quiet, whole herd. And as I closed the door, the ballroom lights still glowing behind me like some distant constellation, I realized something simple and unexpected. I wasn't leaving the building. I was leaving the burden. Because silence had been my refuge for too long, I let others narrate the story while I sat in the corners of rooms I helped build, shrinking so others could shine. But tonight silence was a choice. And the truth? The truth found its voice. Not in speeches, not in titles, but in memory. And memory once awoken does not go quietly. So no, I didn't stay until the end. But for the first time in decades, I didn't walk away forgotten. I walked away remembered, and that was enough.